Good morning, everyone. We are here to discuss something that I don't think any of you have heard about before this morning, drought contingency planning in the Colorado River Basin. There has been recent progress made, which you'll hear about in a few minutes. The states have worked very hard, the 7 basin states, to pull together this drought contingency plan, but it would not have been possible without the support and assistance and enthusiasm of the Bureau of Reclamation. They've given us tremendous help in modeling and mentored agreements very effectively. And so to bring you up to date on the drought contingency plan in the Colorado Basin, we have with us today the Upper Colorado Region Regional Director and the Lower Colorado Region Regional Director from the Bureau of Reclamation. Later, Andy Mueller and Jim Lockhead will give us a state perspective, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So we'll kick it off with Brent.
Mild applause for the Fed. That's good. So, how do we cue the slides up to the screen? Okay, great. We're up. Thanks. So, well, it's good to be here. I hear a few folks have found that their cars are missing in the parking lot. So, if you need to get up and go check that, now might be the good time to do it. I want to touch just a little bit on the current
That's only for if you valeted your car. Sorry.
Current hydrology for just a minute. Not sure what that was. I hear voices sometimes and feel like I'm receiving inspiration, so I'm not. That one I need to hear one more time. So anyway, let me touch on current hydrology, and then I'll get into the DCP for just a minute. So here we have the map of the Upper Basin. You all know where we're at on that in the Colorado. You're familiar with this chart. This is representing the storage that currently exists in the Upper Basin. You can see, of course, the large bucket there's Powell at the bottom of the system, and then we have Flaming Gorge. This might be on a timer. So anyway, you're all familiar with the system in the Colorado River Storage Project features in the Upper Basin. Then we have the current hydrology. If I can back this thing up, we might be on a auto. This is current hydrology. You guys just look at the slides, I'll tell you what they mean. You can keep up that way. So we have a map that's going to show the current hydrology coming right up here in just a second. This year's average, right? It's just a little bit above 100%. This particular slide, I think, is probably a couple weeks old or a week old, and it hasn't gotten any better over the last week. So right around 100% of precipitation in the Upper Basin right now. What we're suffering from, though, is last year's dry year, and so the runoff that's forecast is not that great. Last year, you all remember, it was third lowest on record, inflow into Powell. Terry, I'm going to hand you this. So I think that rotational, not sure what those are, but enjoy them. Is there a way to just kill the slides? Anyway, so last year was bad, right? Third lowest on record. Forecast, or the inflow into Powell over the water year was a little under 5 million acre feet, around 4.5 million acre feet. We released 9 million acre feet from the Upper Basin to the Lower Basin, so the math is pretty simple, isn't it? More went out than came in. And we saw a significant drop in the reservoir elevation at Powell, which further heightens the picture that we're going to talk about in just a second, which is DCP. Looking at this year, it's not that great. As I mentioned, spring runoff projected into PAL is about the same as the whole year last year, so under 5 million, right around that 4.5 million acre feet. That's what's forecast to come into PAL. Forecast release is around 8.6 million acre feet. If you looked at the entire year inflow into PAL, we're going to release a little bit more than comes in likely this year. Because a lot of the water that's coming down, we know it goes into groundwater and recharges the soil moisture. So it's not looking really good, but what happens is, we know if you're familiar with the interim guidelines, next year in 2020, looks like that year might be a 748 release from PAL to Meade, further exacerbating the problem in the system, doesn't it? So, we've been talking about DCPs for the last year. It's great to be in the Upper Basin, I'll tell you that. Terry, looking forward to hear what you're going to have to say about the Lower Basin. Because the spotlight, to be honest, has been on the Lower Basin, hasn't it? It's been on Arizona and California in particular. The Upper Basin, as you all know, has been pretty much prepared to sign off on drought contingency plans for over a year, with some of the details still being worked out. But there's really three elements. If you haven't followed this, there's really three elements to the DCP in the Upper Basin. Two of those are written into the agreements, and one is a continuation of an ongoing program, and that first one is weather modification. So there's continued emphasis and support from everyone, including reclamation in weather modification in the Upper Basin. There's a little bit of a nuance with this. You may not be aware of. The federal government for a while was only interested in doing research on weather modification, wasn't really into supporting operations of those facilities, because statistically it just didn't show you got your bang for the buck that you were spending. Had a shift in focus on that. Now we're supporting operations as well, so that's good news from my perspective. And the other two elements that are included in DCP are the drought response operations piece. This is pretty simple. If you know the system, Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo reservoirs are above Lake Powell. Drought response operations would look at moving water from those elevations down to Powell to protect elevation 3490. 3490 is the minimum power pool elevation. So that's important to us in the Upper Basin because we rely on those power revenues to do a lot of things, including maintaining the facilities. It also gives us a little bit more insurance that we can meet the compact deliveries from PAL, having that additional storage in PAL. So the Upper Basin looks at the triggering elevation. Might not use terms that are too comfortable with folks, but it's 3525. 3490, minimum power pool. 3525 is when we start to work with the states, and this is a state-led effort. Reclamation's partnering, working with the states, but it's state lead. States work together with Reclamation to lay out a plan how we might release water from those upper reservoirs. Functionally, Flaming Gorge is the big bucket, isn't it? It's over 3 million acre feet. So functionally, that's the one that can have the biggest impact on moving water in the Upper Basin to PAL. But all of the reservoirs can participate in propping up that minimum power pool of 3490. A little aside, I grew up in Rexburg, Idaho. I was there the day Teton Dam failed, and I was young. Well, I'm still a young man, but I was much younger man then. And I recall standing on the roof of my father's house, looking across the ag lands, thinking I was going to see a blue wave of water coming across the fields. In my mind, it was ocean-like, right? And what really happened was indiscernible between the color of the water and the fields. was so mixed up, you couldn't really tell the difference where that leading wave was, other than a little bit of dust that was created and rubble that was running in front of the wave from Teton Dam failure. Mentally, I've kind of seen this with releasing water from Flaming Gorge, this nice blue wave of water that would come down the Green River and the Colorado River and subsequently into Powell. That's not the way it's going to be. It's going to be indiscernible, right? We're going to decide how to release water from those upper reservoirs, and we'll work within the existing records of decision and environmental compliance that we have in the upper basin, and we'll release the water. You won't know if you're on the river that that's even happening, but it will. Our commitment in the upper basin is to work within existing compliance that we have on our facilities, and we can do that. So the last piece is one that I think will be talked about a little bit more from some of the other speakers, but that's the demand management storage element. Demand management storage is an interesting one. We have these beautiful facilities in the upper basin, crisp facilities. Right now they have a lot of space. It's mostly filled with air, some filled with water. And so demand management storage is an opportunity to have the states come up with a program, conserve water, store it in PAL or the other CRSP reservoirs, and have some ownership of that. Ownership might not be the right word, but it really is dedicated to protecting the upper basin from those calls that might come from shortage. And what was learned from system conservation is, it takes time to build up enough storage or conserved water to make a difference. Hence the storage component in DCP. We're excited about this in reclamation. It's going to be a new deal in the upper basin as we work that through. There's great opportunities for us. Questions come up on how does that impact the tier determinations and what would release. Certainly we wouldn't want to conserve water in the upper basin and release it to the lower basin. That doesn't make any sense to incentivize conservation in the upper basin. So right now, today Terry will talk about this a little bit more too, I think, but we know the commissioner at Cruis set a deadline, January 31st. Happened to be yesterday. Perfect timing for 2 reclamation RDs to come and speak. And I'll tell you, it made folks a little bit nervous on what we might say, not knowing the outcome of some of the things that happened yesterday in Arizona in particular, but Terry will talk about that more. Good things are happening in the lower basin, in the upper basin as far as reclamation is concerned. We're still anxious to get to the point to sign the DCPs. Let's get to the end, implement those together collectively with our state partners and move forward. So I think I'll wrap up my remarks. I still have a few minutes. I could tell a few jokes, but we'll let the lower basin cover those too.
Now we'll hear from the Lower Colorado Region Director, Terry Fulp.
Terry, before you get up, we actually, those slides were on animation, so we've actually rewound them. So if you want to just, they're not on auto animate anymore, auto advance. So if you just kind of we'll walk back through those again real quick.
Okay, well, I'm a little afraid to touch this, but I'll set it here for now. Thank you all for inviting us here today. As most of you know, this is my second home, at least, or my original home, maybe. Nevada isn't maybe permanent, but it's been a wonderful place to be, and particularly to be on this river system. So we stand at the cusp again of another great move forward on this river system. You've heard us say this. We've never been closer to DCP than we are today. I believe that really holds today. But you've also heard our commissioners say, close isn't done. And so, although I can't tell you how pleased we are with the action the Arizona legislature took yesterday, that is a major step. But we have lots of other steps to take. And I likened it this morning when I was able to wake up where it's chilly and there's white stuff on the ground. And I thought about maybe the analogy, the best analogy, is we've come over that hump on your snowboard and you're looking down the slope and you're trying to figure out, is it moguls and how steep is it? At least that's, for me, that's what I have to do. And so let me say this, it's not a bunny slope left, but we definitely went over the top of the hill yesterday. I do believe there's some moguls in front of us, and the question will be, how deep are they? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go, perhaps. So I'll gingerly hit the advance button here and see. Brent, your slides were really cool. And that's his best slide that we didn't get to, Lake Powell being full in 2000, so I won't, but there's my slide, Lake Mead not being very full. And it's all about risk, it really is, isn't it? And so when we put the interim guidelines in place, we knew that we were coming out of a period of relatively high flows in the late 90s, where both those reservoirs were nearly full at that 2000 period, and went immediately into the worst 5-year, on record, worst 5 years in terms of average inflow into Lake Powell. So quickly, how quickly things turned around, and we did the interim guidelines in response to that, and you all understand that, I know. And we hoped it was good enough through 2026, but we knew there were hydrologies out there that we didn't have enough tools in the toolbox, so to speak, in the guidelines to get us through that. But that was the deal we could make at the time. And so I showed this slide, you've all seen it, it's about risk. And so back in that 2000 period, and first let me define the two panels. It's all about hydrologic assumptions because that is our biggest uncertainty, as you all know. On the left-hand side is if we assume the full record of history repeats itself as the future hydrology. And then the right-hand side is a different view of hydrology, and that is that maybe the last 30 years or so are more indicative of the future. And particularly not that early wet part of the 20th century that we all know about. And so the little gray, the vertical bar axis, is chance, and the horizontal axis is time. Hopefully you can all see that. And it's about Lake Mead getting to 1020. A little teacup diagram over on the right shows you that at 1020 we have less than 6 million acre-feet of water in a reservoir that is 25 million acre-feet essentially, and a reservoir that releases about 9 million acre-feet a year, absent shortages and other reductions perhaps due to DCP. And so now the gray hashed area on the left, that's what we thought our risk of getting meat to 1020 each year through 2026 when we did the guidelines. And then the green says, again, we're assuming full historic hydrology repeats itself. The green is what's our risk today. And what's the difference in our knowledge? Well, we've seen this last 19 full years of relatively low flows. That's the gain of knowledge that we have. And then the blue there shows if we implement the DCP as envisioned, we could push that risk back down to where we thought it was. Are there still hydrologies with DCP that would blow us out of the water? There are. So this is not the fail-safe, but this is the right thing to do. And we all, about 5.5 years ago, decided this is the right thing to do. And I can only commend everyone, many in this room and throughout the basin, who have continued in a resilient, sometimes flexible manner to try to make this work. And again, we're very close. The far right is just that more dire look at hydrology in the future, and you can see that the DCP still can push us back down into that risk area or chance of occurrence area of 5 to 10% that we would like to do. All right. So you've all, if you've heard me talk before, you've heard this slide. Notice it's not just numbers, there's actually little pictures on it now, but the bottom line story is the same. If you do the simple balance, hydrologic balance, mass balance, checkbook balance, whatever term you want to put to it, when we are getting what used to be called the minimum objective release of 8.23 million acre feet from Lake Powell, given average hydrology in the Grand Canyon, et cetera, evaporation losses, you can see all of it. And we deliver 9 million acre feet of water, plus some extra water that has to go downstream to get it all in the right places. We operated a deficit at Lake Mead of roughly 1.2 million acre feet. So 1 million acre feet. If we want to stop a decline of Lake Mead and give ourselves that reduction in risk, we have got to take care of that imbalance. That's the bottom line. There is no way around it. And so, as you might guess, and many of you know, that's what the DCP does for the lower basin. So this is a complicated table. We won't go through it all, but I think the understanding of what is in this is key to understanding the DCP from the lower basin perspective. Okay, so down the vertical axis is Lake Mead elevation in bands, and those bands trigger actions when Mead is in those bands. Along the horizontal are the reductions in what would be released out of Lake Mead. We also call them contributions. It is about leaving water in Lake Mead. I do believe the contribution viewpoint of that is a good viewpoint, especially because this is a voluntary, state-driven solution. This is not a mandated federal Secretary of the Interior solution. The commissioners made it very clear, absent this solution, we in the department will, in fact, go figure out what to do. None of us believe that's the best path. I doubt any of you in this room think that's the best path. And so that's why we were willing, all of us, to work 5.5 years to get to this point to avoid that being the path. And again, we are very close. So entities, we're not going to go down to the water district entity, but by the state entities, and you're going to see Mexico on it. So let me just walk you through some key things. In the interim guidelines, we implemented the shortage tiers, as we called them, with shortage volumes, and as all of you are very aware, those shortages would fall on the Central Arizona Project and the Southern Nevada Water Authority in a 96%, 4% split to CAP, roughly. So primarily CAP shortages. If you get all the way down to 1025, we would have kicked in 625,000 acre feet of shortages if Mexico was involved. So once we landed the interim guidelines, we set out really diligently to get ourselves in the same place with our partners across the border. And through minute 319 and then subsequent minute 326, you see they have a column there, and their number of 125 adds in, so that at 1020 right now, we would implement 1025, we'd implement 625,000 acre feet of shortages. So think if you're down at that place, you got less than 6 million acre-feet of water in that reservoir. You've kicked in 625,000 acre-feet of shortages. How much is left to stop a decline of Lake Mead? Well, another 600,000. So what's in the guidelines is we'd all sit down and reconsult. And we didn't think the risk of getting there was very high, so that seemed acceptable to all of us in the basin. But what we see now is that risk is too high. And so if we're waiting till then to sit down and figure out what we're going to do to get another 600,000 acre-feet or so of contributions, water left in Lake Mead, you're in a lot of pressure. There's not a lot of time. And that's, again, the motivation of DCP. All right, so DCP, there's the 3 states in the lower basin. Their totals, and that all totals 600,000 acre-feet. You can see them very clearly, hopefully, Arizona, Nevada, and California. So they ratchet up in terms of those contributions as Lake Mead goes down, just like shortages would do. And that's hopefully pretty clear. This is one I want you to make sure you see. In minute 323, Mexico has a drought contingency plan baked into the minute. Not only do they have those reductions that I just showed that would total 125, they have a drought contingency plan. They call it the water scarcity plan, the binational water scarcity plan. What triggers it? What kicks it in? Our lower basin drought contingency plan. Really the plan throughout the basin, but the upper basin is ready. So it's really our lower basin plan kicks Mexico's plan in. Already negotiated, baked into the minute, they're ready to go. This is very proactive water management, if I could say that. All right, we often ask about California, and maybe that'll come up in our discussions here as we go, but California. We all know that in this 1968 act that allowed us to build authorized and appropriated money to build the CAP project, that the CAP water was deemed junior to all of California's 4.4 million acre-foot apportionment. So many are asked, and particularly in California have asked, why would we agree to this? What would we do? Well, first of all, we're all in this together. The risk is shared. If we're down that low and we get a couple of bad years of hydrology, can I just say all hell breaks loose? I don't know what else better to say, right? So we're certainly all in it together. So that's a reason, but also a reason is in this drought contingency plan, we have water banking now in Lake Mead. We've proven that in these first 11 or so years that it works well. People are into it, right? It's a good thing. Primarily the California entities and primarily Metropolitan Water District. But we don't authorize delivery of your bank water below 1075. When you're in shortage, you can't take your water out. So now under DCP, within limits, the water can be put in and taken out. So the banking mechanism doesn't stop now when we go to 1075, below 1075 or in shortage. That's what California gets from it. And then their contributions are just that. They just agree to lock away some of their banked water when we get to 1045. That water stays in Mead, can't come out until Mead recovers to 1110. So that's the gist of it. I just bring up to, there's the total. If you're down there, you've at least solved the mass balance problem for most hydrologies. Let me say it that way. And we hope it gets us through this 7 to 8 year period to enable us to negotiate what we're going to do past 2026. I'd be remiss if I didn't circle that number. We in the federal government have agreed to use our best efforts to, through system efficiencies, save an additional 100,000 acre-feet of water that's not baked into the table. All right. So that's DCP in a nutshell. I want to leave time for these other great speakers. If we have time for questions or however we're going to do that, a dialogue, we'd be glad to do it. Let me just once again say to you all, thank you for inviting us here. This is the right thing to do for the basin. and we've never been closer than we are today. Thank you.
So as Brent pointed out, the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan has three aspects. The first is augmentation, which we hope to accomplish through weather modification and phreatophyte removal. Obviously, that would be a small contribution, but we thought we had to do everything possible to put it in the plan. Second is the drought response operations of the CRSP reservoirs. You see there on the chart of agreements, the drought response operations agreement. You know, in water, we love acronyms, and originally that was the Drought Operations Agreement, but we thought DOA was a poor acronym for a significant agreement, so we added the response. And the final element of the Upper Basin Plan is demand management. The state of Colorado, through the Water Conservation Board in November, laid out its policy for developing demand management, and that it would, at least in the beginning, be a temporary, voluntary, compensated program for reducing consumptive use in the Upper Basin. Now we have with us Jim Lockhead, CEO of Denver Water, and Andy Mueller, who's the manager of the Colorado River District, and they're going to help us understand how we are all going to come together as Coloradans to get this demand management program figured out. Jim?
Thanks, John. First of all, I'd like to express my appreciation to the speakers on the previous panel, Dan, Pat, and Secretary Vilsack, and underscore the importance of what they were talking about in terms of the vital role of agriculture in the basin, and particularly want to underscore Pat's comments about watershed health. And obviously Denver Water has been extremely active in forest management, forest treatments, and watershed health, given the risk to our system and the common risks that we share in that area. So I really support those comments. Second thing I'd like to do is to express my appreciation to the federal team. It's been an amazing journey over the last 20, 30 years in the Colorado River Basin, and one of the things that we've seen has been, despite what happens in Washington, despite changes of administration, we've seen consistent, steadfast leadership and a working relationship between the Department of the Interior and the basin states and the major water users in the states. Ann Castle, Jennifer Gimbel are here. There are a number of former federal employees that have been with Reclamation and the Department of the Interior. As all that group has changed, there's been just consistent leadership and partnership, and so that's been extremely important in terms of the progress that we've made. I'd like to talk a little bit about why Colorado, from Denver Water's perspective, I think from all of our perspectives, needs to support the DCP and in particular participate in productively and support the development of a potential demand management program in the basin. First of all, I want to acknowledge that the Upper Basin has a number of very substantial legal arguments under the Colorado River Compact as to why we may be relieved of several of our obligations under that compact. Terry's slide on the mass balance basically illustrated the overuse and the structural imbalance in the lower basin. However, from a legal standpoint, I'll go back to my old legal days, the fact that one state may be in potential violation of their obligations does not relieve other states of our obligations to comply with those obligations under the compact. And I would assert that from an Upper Basin perspective, we continue to maintain an obligation to protect our legal position affirmatively as a basin so that we can meet our obligations under the Colorado River Compact. That also doesn't waive or relieve any argument that we may have if we ever came to that point in the lower basin of any of those legal defenses that we would have under the compact. So anything we're doing under the drought contingency plan preserves our legal position and in fact I would assert strengthens our legal position on an interstate basis. It's clear the experience of Colorado in the Arkansas Basin, the experience of New Mexico in the Pecos River Basin. The Supreme Court doesn't like states that kind of just put their head in the sand and pretend that problems are going to go away. And I think that those are valuable lessons to learn, that we need to be proactive in meeting our obligations under the compact. The second reason is that we are at a potential point where, given the elevation of the reservoirs, given the complexity of the issues and our ability to comply with our obligations, we are at the point where we really need to be sitting down and having pretty intense discussions about how we're going to comply with those obligations. Right now, it's true, we're at about 92 million acre feet on average on the 10-year running average at Leaf Ferry. But there's a big year that's going to come off of that 10-year running average in about 2 or 3 years that will drop that average significantly. More importantly, and Terry talked a little bit about hydrology, and I think one of the benefits that reclamation has brought to the table in terms of the interstate discussions has been a common modeling platform and statistical analysis about what our chances are of getting to this condition or that condition. But one of the things that we found is that every time we've made one of these major landmark agreements, the hydrology has gone in a way that nobody predicted. So I think Terry would acknowledge that those are just models, and they don't necessarily predict what the future is going to be. And certainly, if you look at one single trace, starting in 2000, if that hydrology were to repeat itself, Lake Mead is literally dry in about 3 years. Not saying that's likely, not saying that I hope that that's going to happen, I'm just saying that that's a possibility. And as water users, certainly as a water utility, we need to be prepared for the possible and not just assume that what's probable is going to happen. And if that occurs, either in 3 years or 5 years or in 10 years or at any point in the future, it not only impacts the hydroelectric revenues that are used to support endangered species programs and all of the operations at Glen Canyon Dam, but certainly from an upper basin compact perspective, puts us in a very deep hole. So we need to protect against that. The third point is that if the DCP gets finalized and if it is approved by federal legislation, one of the provisions in the DCP is that the upper basin has a 500,000 acre foot pool that is protected from equalization and other operations in Lake Powell, into which we could put demand management water. So the situation that we saw I think it was last summer, with the Arizona sweet spot and the idea that any water we might put into Lake Powell could leak out into the lower basin through tiering or other equalization releases at Lake Powell, the 500,000 acre feet gives us the ability to put that water in a safe place where it's released based on the call of the Upper Colorado River Compact Commission. The fourth point is that no one wants the result of a situation where we haven't come together collectively to arrive at a solution. I think that's why you saw the Arizona legislature act yesterday, is that the possibility of federal or state intervention, the possibility of interstate litigation, the possibility of litigation within Colorado about how we comply, has serious consequences, and the chaos that would result is something that I think no one wants to see. And I think Commissioner Berman's statement that was released yesterday in the Federal Register asking for comments makes it clear that the department continues to be prepared to act in the event that the DCP doesn't come together. And I think Colorado needs to do our part to make sure that the demand management piece is done in a way that protects all water users in Colorado, East Slope and West Slope. There's been a lot of talk in newspapers about targets on backs. I would argue that if we don't come together and proactively develop a Colorado solution to demand management and participation in that, the target will be on all of our backs together. It's a situation that we all want to avoid. The Colorado Water Conservation Board is considering a process, and I'm sure you all know that the board approved a policy statement regarding demand management following its September board meeting in Steamboat Springs. And I think that part of that demand management program and part of the DCP also recognizes, as Terry indicated, we're going to be starting some serious discussions in 2020 regarding the reinitiation or reconsideration of the 2007 guidelines. And really, this is a bridge to those negotiations. This is not an ultimate solution to the problems on the river. 500,000 acre feet in Lake Powell is not enough from an upper basin standpoint to manage Lake Powell from potential severe hydrology. And the process that the Water Conservation Board has outlined, I think, recognizes that we need to begin the work on a number of different levels. So at a Water Conservation Board level, what does that program look like? How does it operate? From a state engineer's perspective, what are the issues in terms of shepherding and quantification and the second fill rule and a host of legal issues, the state's export statute, in terms of how we deal with that. We're going to have to face the question about whether or not we need legislation in Colorado. We're going to need to coordinate with 4 upper basin states and the Upper Colorado River Commission. And so we've got a lot of work to do, and we need to roll up our sleeves and get after it. It's going to be I hope, broad and multi-year process if hydrology will allow us to do that. And if hydrology won't, we need to be prepared to move more quickly. But from Denver Water's perspective, we're prepared to engage. We're prepared to engage productively, and as I've indicated many times in the past, we're prepared to contribute our share of water into the solution that would be collectively agreed to within Colorado and the other upper basin states, that if it's necessary, we would need to be able to manage for our own mutual benefit and survival in the upper basin. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Andy Mueller from the River District.
Well, thank you, Jim, and I want to thank the Colorado Water Congress for putting this whole program together. It really has been tremendous. There are times where you come to water seminars and I feel like you don't actually get much out of them. The Water Congress consistently puts together a program that for at least some of us and hopefully all of us is really insightful. I also want to really thank our federal officials up here on the podium with us. These guys work incredibly hard and are also incredibly intelligent and just very upfront about what they're doing and what we need to do on the river. The stereotype that many of us carry around about federal officials is really blown out of the water when you talk about Terry and Brent. So I think it's great and a real honor to have them here. I think I want to get to our states, where we are in the state and how we move forward, but I want to stress, and Jim touched on this, and certainly Terry, the imbalance in the Colorado River system is caused by a number of factors. And one of those is certainly as Terry, I think, politely calls it, the mass balance problem down in Lake Mead. The historic and continuing overuse of water by the lower basin. And, at approximately 1.2 million acre feet a year, that overuse has driven us to a point where we are truly talking about having a basin-wide crisis in terms of being able to keep this river and the 40 million people out of a significant period of chaos. And the lower basin DCP is a great first step. But when you looked at Terry's chart in the lower left-hand corner, when it hits the lowest level, the lower basin states and the country of Mexico are just about fixing the structural deficit, the overuse. from an upper basin perspective, and as we renegotiate the operating guidelines coming up, we've really got to focus on getting that 1.2 million moved way up in elevation in Meade, meaning every year they overuse that 1.2 million, they keep the entire basin in crisis. And when you add to that the threats that we see and that we deal with up here and everywhere in the basin with climate change and with our warming temperatures in this southwest portion of the United States, we can see very clearly that keeping us at that level of crisis where the reservoir is threatening to be at a 1020 in Lake Mead is not a path to security and economic viability for our entire 7-state region. And so it is important that the state of Colorado, which has historically been leaders in the Colorado River and in the Upper Basin, work collaboratively as an entire state to make sure that that issue is front and center as we renegotiate those operating guidelines on the river. And with all that being said, however, I think it is incredibly important and a time where you will find Jim Lockhead and myself on the podium absolutely in agreement that our state also and the Upper Basin also has to make sure that we do everything we can to keep the Upper Basin in compliance with its obligations. Jim and I both happen to have legal backgrounds. I spent 23 years litigating. I can tell you that allowing the system to crash into some form of compact call will create chaos. And while it may employ a lot of lawyers, it will not provide the economic certainty that our state needs to survive. And that's our entire state. That's all the little communities and the larger communities on the West Slope that my district and Southwestern represent. It's the large metropolitan areas here on the Front Range. We need each other. We need the economic security of long-term water security. And taking out an insurance program or a policy in the form of a demand management program is something we need to really, really look at, study, and understand, and when feasible, implement. And it's not that the crisis, and I think, depending upon the hydrology, we could see this be accelerated, but I believe we are at a point in the Colorado River where the Upper Basin does have some time to really get this demand management program right. Demand management, reduction of consumptive use, is an incredibly threatening concept to Western water users, and certainly West Slope water users. Our agricultural community is concerned that what this is really about is taking water from ag and bringing it into urban areas. I hear that same thing when I go to Cattlemen's Association meetings that involve the East Slope agriculture. This is a time where we have to work collaboratively, both our urban friends and our rural friends, to figure out how we do this together and how we recognize the values that are important to each of us. The values that are important to the small communities on the Western Slope in terms of preserving those communities and their quality of life, as well as the food production, the wildlife landscape, the benefits to wetland creation, all of those things that our farms and ranches bring, the enormous outdoor rec and tourism dollars that are aided by having viable agriculture on the West Slope and on the East Slope. We need to recognize that that's not a reservoir sitting there for everybody to look at as something to drain. And I appreciate the fact that what we're hearing and the commitments that have been made to share the pain of this drought management program. And we have to find a way. There are lots of tricky areas that we have to work through, and I think Jim did a good job of listing them. I want everybody to know that the River District is committed to proactively engaging and working with the CWCB and the Front Range to figure out how we can stand a program up that truly protects all of us in this situation. And to not do so, to not engage proactively in that conversation, would be irresponsible of every one of us in this room. And so to have this opportunity to figure this out, to create that insurance policy is important. We are very happy and appreciative of the actions of the CWCB board in November when they passed their demand management policy. This week at their meeting earlier this week, the staff presented their plan to kind of roll out some task force segments and get to work on the hard work of creating a program that will work. I want you to know that the River District sat down with the Front Range Water Council yesterday to talk about how the Front Range is working on a program that will work for them. And we on the West Slope are working on trying to figure out rules and sideboards that we believe will help protect our communities as we move forward. And we're not doing that as opponents, we're doing that as collaborators. And it's what we should be doing. So we do believe that our state needs to focus on a voluntary, temporary, and compensated program. And when we say temporary, a lot of that temporary depends upon what the hydrology brings us. Depends on what the climate brings us in the future. But what we mean by that when we talk about it is that we want, from a West Slope perspective, our agriculture and our industries and our cities that are going to participate in these programs to have the opportunity to use the water when they need it and to monetize their assets into a program when they can figure out ways not to use it. Basically, ways that we can encourage and create sustainable communities. And it's worth an incredible amount of effort and, from my perspective, a lot of meetings and brain damage and traveling in order to get that done. Because the alternative is very significant in terms of seeing a mandatory curtailment coming down the pike and dealing with the results that we don't want to see to both sides of the divide. So with that, I just want to say I appreciate the collaborative efforts, and I really think the state is headed in the right direction. It is, in our state, I think, we're hoping those moguls are not too big as we go downhill and to figure out these problems, but I think we'll do it. So, thank you.
Is this mic working? Doesn't seem like it. Hello? Is this working? Can you hear me out there? Yes. So, a couple of questions for the panelists. It was widely reported in December that Reclamation Commissioner Berman issued an ultimatum to the Basin states to complete the DCP by January 31. And if the states could not accomplish that, she said she would issue a notice to solicit comments from the governors of the Basin states on how to proceed from here. Well, as we all know, Arizona beat the deadline by, I think, 10 minutes yesterday evening and signed their DCP. But Commissioner Berman did issue the notice, so it's not over yet. There is still more to be accomplished. So I'm going to ask Terry to let us know what yet is to be done in the lower basin.
So Brent and I had on the last slide kind of all these agreements listed out, and we certainly didn't want to take you through those. But those down at the bottom of those listed a whole lot of categories of agreements. So there's, even with Tom Bishotsky now getting the authorization very clearly from his legislature to sign the DCP agreements, there are still a whole lot of underlying agreements that have not been finished. This is not unusual in these kinds of complex water deals, if I could use that term. You just got to pick them all off. I can assure you every one of them is being worked on. Just to let you know, I believe today, 7 basin-wide, there's what's called the coordinating committee meeting probably right now to put the final touches on even the top level agreements. So there's lots of people that have to come together here. But again, I just say, John, I think we're there in the sense that we've crested that peak. We can get these agreements done. There are some disagreements that we'll work through, but we will get them done.
John,
Thank you. Go ahead.
can I supplement that just a second? Don't know if this microphone's on. Perhaps, so the Federal Register's notice came out early this morning, late yesterday, and it asks for input by March 4th, not until March 4th, and then gives a period of time, I think 15 days or so, for receipt of input by the department. If the DCP documents that Terry referred to are executed, signed off, in this 30-day window between now and March 4th, then the commissioner will rescind or withdraw the Federal Register notice.
Thanks, Brent, for that clarification. A question for you. We both mentioned the Drought Response Operations Agreement. I'm often asked how that would function. Can you describe how that agreement works?
Yeah, sure, John, just real basic. As has been mentioned, reclamation in the Upper Basin states have a great working relationship now and have had in the past. And so working with the basin states, when we hit that elevation 3525, then we develop a plan collaboratively on how we're going to release, where we're going to release from those upper reservoirs, and look at how we might be able to do those daily releases out of each of the reservoirs. And so it'll be, I think it'll be transparent. Well, I know it'll be transparent in the sense that it won't be noticeable. It'll also be transparent in the fact that we'll be working openly with one another.
So, Andy, we've heard also that these DCPs require federal legislation to proceed. Can you tell us how that works and why?
I think that federal legislation is one of the bigger potential moguls out there on this Terry's downhill slope. So our storage account in Powell that the Upper Basin has asked for, we would like that as good water users to be free of charge from the federal government and under significant Upper Basin control. That at least arguably requires some federal legislation to clearly authorize our Bureau to give us that space. So we in the Upper Basin really need a piece of federal legislation. The Lower Basin, in order to operate, to leave water in the reservoir during those critical periods and then pull it out, also requires some tweaks to the existing federal laws that govern the operation of Meade. And the legislative push is moving forward, and many of us are optimistic that it will happen. We have some fantastic representatives from our state here in Colorado, senators and representatives, as well as the other 7 basin states that have all committed to working with the water users to move this forward. The timing of that is still a little bit in question, but we are working on that. And I think it's important for everybody to realize that we actually do need an act of Congress before this stuff gets put in place.
So thank you, Andy. That was very good. And let me just add this. What I don't want anyone who's not had any experience with us, and when we talk about federal legislation, to think we're going out and seeking an 800-page piece of legislation. This is pretty straightforward stuff. if it works the way we envision it to. It's a simple one paragraph, notwithstanding any other law. Secretary is directed to implement these agreements. And so the nice thing is the agreements are from all of us, and the secretary is simply directed to go do it. So we often say it in my office, it gets tacked on to another bill. So we're just hopeful that we're hearing that there's a bill to tack it on to that's going to get through the legislature.
That's all we have, folks. Would you join me in thanking our panelists for today?